Because it's easy to stigmatize a statistic. It's easy to stereotype a statistic. But you can't stigmatize or stereotype the human spirit. We need to start having more discussions about the spirit of Alzheimer's, the people behind the disease. At its core, spirituality is all about connection. As human beings, we have a deep desire to connect with ourselves, with each other, and with a higher power and purpose. And this desire to connect transcends the bounds of formal religion and pervades every aspect of our lives. So when considering spirituality in the context of Alzheimer's care, we need look no further than this desire for connection. The key to spiritual survivals for families affected by this disease is to connect with others who have been there before. As elder care professionals, we can facilitate these connections. And that's what we do at agingcare.com. By connecting family caregivers with information, inspiration, and each other, we let them know 3 things. You are capable, you are supported, and you are not alone. And these 3 messages underlie all of our efforts as an organization, and they're what inspired us to create Fade to Blank, Life Inside Alzheimer's, an online documentary which tracks the journeys of 3 families dealing with the disease. Now, if you're wondering why a 27-year-old with no official caregiving experience is standing in front of you today, I understand. But I'm not here as an expert per se, as much as a conduit. Over the years, many families affected by Alzheimer's have shared their stories with me so that I could use them to inspire and support the caregivers who come to agingcare.com. Today, I have the privilege of sharing some of these stories with you, of giving you a glimpse into the life that exists inside Alzheimer's. I'd like to introduce you to 3 very unique human beings, David, Rick, and Jean. Though each of their Alzheimer's journeys are unique, they all begin in the same way, with a drive. David was driving down a dusty road towards a prison just outside of Richmond, Virginia. He was going to visit his friend, Jens Suring, who'd been in prison for more than 2 decades. David had always believed in Jens's innocence, and so he made regular trips to visit his friend at the facilities where he was staying. This would be David's first trip to the Virginia prison, yet as he drove down the road, he was struck with a powerful wave of deja vu. He felt like he'd been there before. As many of us do, David shrugged it off as a fluke, and he went inside to see his friend. While the 2 men were visiting, they were approached by one of the prison chaplains, who greeted David as though he'd met him before. David was confused. He'd never been to this prison, and he'd certainly never met this man. But his confusion was only increased when Jens corroborated the chaplain's story, saying that David had met him during his first visit a few months prior. David was always a bad one for remembering names and faces, and he didn't want to waste his precious time with his friend, so again, he shrugged off the odd occurrence as a fluke. But it troubled him so much that when he went back home, he started flipping through the pages of his calendar. And sure enough, 6 months prior to that very same day, he had visited Jens in that prison. Between driving and visiting with his friend, David estimates that the round trip took about 10 hours. But he remembers nothing about it. In fact, it's as if the first day, that first visit to the prison, never even happened for him. Rick was an EMT on the job when Alzheimer's changed his life forever. He was racing in an ambulance. He and his team were speeding towards a house where a young girl was in the throes of a serious seizure. They managed to keep the young girl alive until they got her to the hospital, where she eventually passed away after more than an hour's worth of desperate resuscitation efforts. Rick had been an EMT for more than 20 years, and he'd witnessed countless tragedies, but the news of this girl's death hit him like a brick wall. He didn't know the girl or her family, but her passing affected him so much that he gathered his team together and he said right then and there, "I'm sorry, but I just can't do this anymore." You see, Rick had been experiencing troubling symptoms of memory loss. He'd forget the meaning of call codes, he'd misremember shortcuts despite having grown up in that town his entire life, and he couldn't bear the thought of one of those memory lapses causing harm to another human being. So he forced himself to quit in the profession that he loved so much. Alzheimer's caught Jean on an ordinary day. She was driving her friend to the doctor's office. She dropped her friend off and went to go look for a parking spot. She got lost along the way and came upon a homeless man on the side of the road. It was wintertime and the man had no coat. Jean, being a good Samaritan, rolled down her window and offered the man her jacket. She asked him if he needed anything else, and he asked her to drive him to the next town over. She ushered him into the passenger seat of her car and drove him an hour away to the next town. The man got out and walked away, taking her coat with him, and Jean calmly drove back home. Her daughter Michelle was waiting for her in a panic. Her mother had inexplicably disappeared hours before, and a series of what-if scenarios were running through Michelle's mind for hours. Jean, on the other hand, couldn't understand why her daughter was so upset. She wasn't even aware of the danger that she had put herself in when she picked up an unknown hitchhiker. References are often made to the 7 stages of Alzheimer's disease, and it makes sense that we would want it that way. Stages, even ones that plot out a loved one's steady decline, serve as reassuring guideposts, indicators that someone has walked this path before us. But what is often overlooked is that family caregivers experience their own journey with the disease, and it's a bit different than their loved ones. And so, an analysis of more than 100,000 discussions that have taken place on the agingcare.com forum led to the development of the 3 Ds of Alzheimer's caregiving: discovery, diagnosis, and disease management. Every caregiver goes through these 3 stages. The first D, discovery, often coincides with the more milder stages of Alzheimer's. This is when family members start to notice troubling changes in a loved one's behavior, such as David and Rick's memory loss, or Jean's inability to recognize her dangerous situation. They are confronted also by feelings of denial, their own feelings and their loved one's feelings. And this denial can manifest in subtle ways. Rick and his family, for many years, attributed his cognitive troubles to the normal aging process, mostly because they didn't want to consider the possibility of Alzheimer's. And Jean's daughter also admits to brushing off her family's concerns over her mother's condition. Mom was sick for a long time, she says, much sicker than I understood. As caregivers come to grips with the gravity of their loved one's condition, they start to seek guidance on how to proceed from others who have been in a similar situation. As a former physician, David was all too aware of what his increasing mental confusion could be signaling, and he knew where to go to get answers. He went to a neurologist, he went through the evaluations, the brain scans, and even participated in several clinical trials. Still, it took him about a year to receive a diagnosis. And when he eventually was diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment, most likely caused by Alzheimer's, he wasn't thrilled, but he wasn't shocked either. Now, despite their professions as EMTs, neither Rick nor his wife, Phyllis June, had any experience with Alzheimer's. And so their knowledge of the disease was pretty minimal. They had to take Rick's doctors at their word when for 7 years they chalked his memory concerns up to depression and unresolved grief. His daughter had died a few years prior, and so some of his doctors said that he hadn't fully processed those emotions, and that was manifesting as memory concerns. Eventually, a neurologist did diagnose Rick with Alzheimer's, early onset Alzheimer's disease, at the age of 57 years old. Jean and her family also had minimal experience with Alzheimer's. Several years prior to her dangerous driving incident, she had moved in with her daughter Michelle because she was experiencing some cognitive difficulties, and she couldn't really live on her own safely anymore. But Over the years, Jean's doctors cycled through a variety of diagnoses: anxiety, depression, Hicks disease, bipolar disorder. One specialist even suggested she spend some time in a psych ward. Michelle doesn't really like to talk about that time very much, but she does refer to it as 19 days of hell. Eventually, they settled on Alzheimer's as the cause of Jean's confusion. The reality is that a way to definitively diagnose Alzheimer's continues to elude us. Some experts estimate that we can determine the disease with about 90% certainty, but much still remains unknown. And so crushed in this vice of uncertainty, denial, and fear are the families dealing with this disease. They want to know more, but at the same time, they don't want to know more. And so this brings us to the diagnosis stage, which often coincides with the more moderate forms of Alzheimer's disease. An official Alzheimer's diagnosis is desired by families because it helps them move forward. Rick says that the revelation of his diagnosis was like a weight being lifted off of his shoulders. Finally, he and Phyllis June could come up with an action plan, a way to move forward. But unfortunately, a diagnosis is difficult to obtain. The sheer number of available tests and screening methods can make seeking a diagnosis frustrating, and knowing where to begin and which specialist to see is a challenging endeavor. Many doctors are hesitant to give a diagnosis because of all this uncertainty. And Jean's doctors seemingly wanted to attribute her problems to anything but Alzheimer's. But even once a diagnosis is given, it's not easy to accept. As one caregiver says, when my mother-in-law's doctor finally came out and said that she had the dreaded A word, I felt like I had been kicked in the gut. I had known she'd had a memory problem for years, but now that it had a name, it seemed worse somehow. For his part, David likens his diagnosis to an abyss opening up underneath him. He knew that his life would be forever changed. So as all of these issues swirl around in the minds of family caregivers, their quest to connect with others who have dealt with similar situations begins in earnest. Alzheimer's is unpredictable. The variable nature of the disease defies confinement into distinct segments. There's no steady rate of decline, but rather an ongoing series of erratic alternations between periods of crystal clear lucidity and extreme confusion. And no one can predict how a particular individual will experience the disease. For instance, David's once sharp physician mind now has trouble playing games with his grandchildren. But at the same time, he understands that his condition affords him some opportunities that he would not have guessed. On a recent blog post on agingcare.com, David writes, "My vulnerability, I suspect, melted that protective shell around me and allowed the love in. Similarly, that vulnerability allowed the community to do things for me, and it's brought us closer together. It seems to me nothing short of a miracle. Suddenly, at age 67, the self-protection that I had held on to all of my life has melted away almost overnight, and I am able to allow in a kind of joy that I've never experienced." Rick has days where he wakes up lucid and alert, but by the time he's done with breakfast, he can no longer remember what he ate. In the afternoon, he'll go to watch television and end up tearing the living room apart because he can't find the remote control that's sitting right in front of him on the couch. His mind no longer recognizes what his eyes are seeing. Of his day-to-day experience, Rick writes, "Yesterday is a blur, and that is nothing new with this disease. I tell people all the time that I have no recollection of yesterdays, and I haven't for a very long time. I often wonder if other patients deal with this, not knowing what transpired yesterday without someone having to remind them. This is the conversation that Phyllis, June, and I have every day. What, if anything, happened yesterday, and what I want to do today. This takes its toll on a person, having to be briefed on the day's activities before the day even begins. But I try to keep things in perspective. Nothing I forget is going to be earth-shattering. No one's life is going to change on account of something I forget to do. But it's the day-to-day aggravation of losing what little short-term memory I have left that is so frustrating. Jean's Alzheimer's is very advanced. She has lost the ability to read and write and speaks very little. But her daughter Michelle continues to search for the spirit that she knows exists inside of her mother. Michelle writes, "I wasn't feeling well when I went to visit Mom today, but I went anyway. I brought her favorite cookies and a Coke. I played her favorite songs and we sang together. Then suddenly, Mom turned to me and said, 'I'm worried about you.' I hugged her and I reassured her that I was okay. This isn't the first time that Mom has surprised me by saying something that parents often say to their children, and it's always something I need to hear. I had my mom back today, just for a moment. I was able to hold back the tears until I got in the car. I miss my mom, but I know that she is there and that she knows what's going on. I believe this is love. Because love is not a memory. It's a feeling in the heart and the soul, never to be forgotten. This disease can take away almost everything, but not the love. The only certainty with Alzheimer's is that the person with the condition will continue to decline, and their episodes of mental clarity will become fewer and farther apart. As family caregivers and their loved ones enter the third D, disease management, the ever-changing nature of Alzheimer's begins to take its toll. The disturbing behavior that often accompanies a loved one's decline has family caregivers actively seeking ways, behavioral, medicinal, and natural, to manage not only their loved one's disease, but their own complex collection of emotions as well. Many caregivers want that magic prescription pill that will make their loved one better, and many are devastated to find that such a panacea does not exist. They want strategies for how to deal with a mother who is sundowning, or a father who won't bathe because he's afraid of water, or a husband who hears voices of people that are no longer there. And they crave help dealing with their own feelings. As one caregiver says, "I just feel so lonely. I don't know how to help myself or how to move forward. My husband is gone, but he is very much still alive." This is the most crucial stage for caregivers to stay connected to each other. No one understands this phase quite like someone who's been there before. Engaging with other caregivers gave Michelle the hope and strength she needed to deal with her mother's disease. "It's changed everything," she says. "I have a relationship with my mother that I never would have otherwise." Millions of Americans are affected by Alzheimer's disease, so why are we focusing on these three families? What makes David, Rick, and Jean so unique, so extraordinary? What makes them so extraordinary is that they are profoundly ordinary. They're human beings just like you and I, with a past, a present, and a future, with family and friends who love and care about them. Their stories are our stories, and by sharing these stories, we can find the strength to face America's most feared disease with grace, providing much needed support for each other all along the way. This is how we apply spirituality to Alzheimer's caregiving, by striving to see and connect with the real people behind the disease. We can't cure Alzheimer's yet, but we can cure the isolation, sadness, and despair of those experiencing it. By fostering a dialogue about Alzheimer's care, and by not buying into the stigma of the disease that still silences so many, we can better support the brave men and women who refuse to abandon their loved ones to a future of a fading mind. That is our mission, to empower caregivers to share their stories, their struggles, their hopes, and as you'll hear from my co-presenter in a few moments, their revelations about life, death, love, and loss. By providing a safe space for families affected by Alzheimer's to share their journey with the disease, we can help them realize you are capable, you are supported, and you are not ever alone. Together, we can shatter the barriers that lead to isolation and fear, and we can create a human-powered spiritual cure for Alzheimer's disease. Thank you.